So thank you to Columbia University's the American Assembly and Incite Center for funding both We Be Imagining and in particular the Assembling Voices Fellowship, which makes this We Be Imagining spring series on the family regulation system possible. Special shout out to Michael Falco, the executive director of the Incite Center. They are helping me today with all the behind the scenes work to make this program broadcast via Zoom and hopefully via YouTube. Also shout out to Internationalism from Below, who is co-sponsoring this event. And I also had the pleasure of being a part of a panel alongside Mabel and Ayantu Tebeso on what's happening in Ethiopia with Haymarket a couple of months ago. So we will be having a panel today. We will be having a panel tracing the family regulation system from the domestic US foster care system, beginning from New York City and tracing it out globally for each month of the series. Each event will be on the third Thursday of the month from 5 to 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time from February to June. In March, we will feature 2 Black mothers who have had their kids snatched up by New York City Administration for Children's Services and 1 mother based in Los Angeles. And the goal of this event today, Family Despite Empire, is centering community-led perspectives versus academic or NGO because of how desperately self-determination is needed to address the intergenerational trauma back home and in the diaspora. Another goal of this event is placing the impact of family separations due to the current conflict in a larger historical context of how adoption has functioned in Ethiopia, both through agencies and in the informal sense of people taking in other people's kids as their own, creating a digital artifact that showcases community practices, beliefs, traditions regarding healing, kinship, and safety. I'm often really averse to doing Zoom conversations because there's something about the genre that really trends towards 101. This is not going to be a 101 for someone who knows absolutely nothing about Ethiopia or absolutely nothing about adoption. But we kind of conceived of this event as an intercommunal conversation for the Black diaspora and thinking through these themes more deeply. And before I introduce these phenomenal guests, I just wanted to share a few additional thoughts. So I was listening to a talk earlier today by Clapton-C. Mavunga. They said when we turn to Africa, all we see is dead bodies, hunger, poverty, refugees, disease. To begin to think about how to address these phenomena within the empire is to, by default, assume these are near biological features of the African landscape, or perhaps more to the point, features of near Blackness as being. Development officials published white papers proposing how to implement aid dependence as a solution to this netherworld marked by deficit. NGOs remote sense from satellites to document the body count, and saviors wait for things to quiet down so they can begin again, like foster care, confronted with the systematic removal of children from their families, the scale at which they are transferred to the care of other groups, other nations, and foreign institutions. It can feel overwhelming. After all, it meets Article 2E of the Genocide Convention. But what such legalistic and institutional narratives conceal is how extended family steps up to care for children whose parents may be unable to care for them. How separation is often impermanent, and adoptees or former foster youth very often seek out and reunite with their biological families. To turn back to Mavunga, we are not just dead bodies, hunger, poverty, and refugees. That performance of visual evidence to quote unquote prove Black suffering is part of a colonial matrix of domination and anti-Black violence, rather than a reflection of some kind of raw truth. It removes us from our agency. And also I'm thinking about that, I draw heavily from Zoe Samudzi's work and her piece, Contemporary Witness of White Witness of Lynching. And so another thought that I had in preparing for this event was the work of Thai scholar Thongchai Winchakul. Sorry, that's my daughter in the background. I have 5 kids that I'm like trying to keep at bay in the midst of this. But they had a critique of Benedict Anderson's imagined communities, and in that there's not just a positive construction of nationhood in the sense of to be Thai is to be X, Y, or Z, to be this, but a negative construction as well, meaning that what matters is not just what Ethiopians are, but what they are not. And to be Ethiopian, as we're seeing now, is to not be Oromo, to not be Tigrayan. And for a lot of us growing up in our communities and with the generational trauma coming from our parents, you know, a lot of what it means to not be is to not be separated from your community, is to not talk about trauma. And so we encounter these like layers of silences. And so one of the goals of this event was not to have a fully comprehensive conversation. And, you know, because Ethiopia is a prison house of nation, there's over 83 different nations, nationalities, and peoples. And I don't think that the goal of the four of us on this panel is to represent all of them, or even for me, like I definitely cannot speak on behalf of all Oromos in the diaspora or back home, but to initiate a conversation which has been in many ways concealed. And the last thing I just wanted to say, and then I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Cassaye Bergano Mcdonald, is that in our communities, and when I say this, I mean for me, like as a member of the Oromo diaspora, I frequently observe a dynamic where the specifying of one group's particular historical relationship to the federal government and state violence is being perceived as a claim on competing grievances within Ethiopia, concluding that XYZ group has suffered more or has more value as a victimized subject. And thinking through this dynamic, I'm reminded of Catherine McKittrick's work, Drawing on Sylvia Wynter, where she states whiteness enacts a hierarchy onto the world, where man exists on these vertical levels, and to be Black is to be measured in relationship to your exclusion from even the hierarchy. All to say that I would like people in the audience to consider dispensing with the hierarchy altogether, to consider that when we gesture towards conceptual frameworks like indigeneity or the South, that it's not blame allocation, rather than an attempt to provide a structural analysis through which we can make sense of our current individual and collective experiences. And the last thing, just before I introduce Cassaye, let me see if I have the, just gonna share my screen real quick. Slideshow. This is a slide that I'm obsessed with. And I have shown at many presentations about predictive analytics in the child welfare system, which is one of my primary research focus. And what you're looking at, there's always tons of acronyms. This comes from the Office of Children and Family Services, OCFS, or the New York State oversight body that regulates New York City foster care. And this is how they classify kids in care by race. And what's very interesting is if you look in the category African American, you will see Black, interracial Black and white, and then you'll see Ethiopian and Haitian. And the reason why I bring this up is a lot of times when people hear that I'm studying the role of tech and mass atrocities in Ethiopia, and then the stuff around child welfare in New York, it seems so disparate. What is the connection? What does one thing have to do with another? But for those of you who have been personally impacted as an adoptee or a trafficked person, or have had some personal relationship to the family regulation system, you're probably familiar with the idea that adoption is often impermanent, that so many adoptions are not just an event of separation, but a process through which not only is that person removed from their family and their culture, but often many of those adoptions are disrupted or dissolved. And for a lot of those international adoptees, particularly from Ethiopia, they were placed back into the foster care system. And so it's not so much that, for example, New York City foster care system targeted Ethiopian or Haitian adoptees, but these are kind of like vestiges in the data of history, showing that in these like previous waves of adoption, kind of what happens in the aftermath. It's not just the sunny picture of the white Christian having the gotcha day with their kid. But so these things are much more connected than we would think. And then just one last thing I'll say about this very bizarre group.
This is Michael, sorry to interrupt. I think the image didn't show. It's showing as loading for everyone. So I just wanted to flag that.
Let me see if it will let me. Oh, maybe you disabled it for me.
It seems to, we're seeing a portion of it, but not the whole one for some reason. So I think it.
Can you see like this? Oh no, you can't see. Let me try again. Share. Can you see now?
Yeah, we can see text. Yeah.
You can see?
Now it says loading. I think it's when you try to go to full screen. So maybe you should just try and zoom in on it. Is that possible?
Oh, can you see this like here?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, I mean, those were mostly my final comments, but you can see here, since you couldn't see before, to the right of African American under the maps category column, what that category includes is Black, interracial, Black and white, Black and Asian, Ethiopian or Haitian. The last like bizarre thing about this rubric is in New York City, and I think this is true in many states, is that Black and Latino are mutually exclusive categories. So through this, we know that Black children are actually undercounted in the New York City foster care system, because if the caseworker just perceives that child to have any kind of quote unquote Latino heritage to the degree that's descriptive of anything, that child will be classified as Latino and no longer Black. So I'm gonna stop sharing now. And I want to introduce our first speaker, Cassaye Bergano Mcdonald. They were adopted due to the war and famine of 1984 to 1985. She is passionate about family preservation and hopes the diaspora can play a more active role in family reunification efforts and ensuring families stay together. Currently, Cassaye is co-editing an anthology written by 32 adoptees from Ethiopia who live in the US, France, Sweden, the Netherlands, Canada, Australia, and Ethiopia. And with that, please go ahead, Cassaye.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for creating this series. It's something that I'm very excited about, and I think that it's long overdue because family separation, whether it's in the States, Ethiopia, China, Alaska, I don't know why I just said that. It's an issue that affects people globally. I mean, people are aware of adoptees, but the people who are marginalized the most in this conversation, I would say, are parents, family members who have who've lost their children. So I will be talking a little bit about parents in Ethiopia. I don't like to call them birth parents. I like to call them parents or parents of adoption loss. So just so that you know what I'm talking about when I say that. It's really an honor to be here to represent an adoptee voice. And also, you know, for me, I also feel like I am representing parents, even though I'm not a parent of adoption loss, but because they're so marginalized, I do feel when I talk about this issue, they're always on my heart. So I just want to start by just contextualizing a little bit. So I was, as Khadijah mentioned, I was adopted in the 80s during the war and famine of 84, 85. I arrived in Canada in 87. My whole life, you know, I grew up in a very white environment in rural Quebec, Canada. And, you know, I was very detached from my roots. I didn't know any Ethiopians. It wasn't really until I was 23 that I went to Ethiopia, and then I met Ethiopians afterwards. And then a few years later, I started getting more interested in adoption. It kind of hit me later on that adoption really played a big impact in my life. And I started, you know, just seeking out adoptees. And then eventually I got involved in adoptee communities. And, you know, what I really thought was like, where are the Ethiopians? Like, I'm not the only one. So I found one, Salvage Evans, who's based in Seattle right now. She's the pioneer, I would say. She's not really active in adoptee spaces right now. But I found her, and it was through my connection with her that we decided to create a group that gathered adoptees together. And so the book that we're authoring, which, you know, everybody participated, it's an anthology. It really was birthed out of, you know, the idea that, you know, we're not hearing about our experiences and also how complex they are. And so the book is coming out sometime this year. I'm really excited about it. So adoptees, you know, are from Canada, from the States, big population in France, a big population in Sweden, the Netherlands, Australia. I probably left a country out, Italy, Spain. So we are everywhere. There's about 30,000, over 30,000 of us actually. And, you know, Khadijah mentioned waves of adoption. And what people aren't really aware about is that there's been waves of Ethiopian adoption. The first wave of adoption started in the late 60s, early 70s from Sweden. And then 80s, there was fewer adoptions, but they were mostly to, I would say, Europe, France mostly. And then I was adopted, but it was a private adoption. But I would say adoption started speeding up after the famine, after 1984, 1985. And then they sort of increased. And so there was another big wave, I would say, like in the 1990s, that was more to, again, Europe, the Netherlands, US, and then sort of the adoptions peaked in the 2000s to the States, and also countries like Italy and Spain. So the thing that's interesting and also very disturbing about this is that the same lie has been told since the 1970s, that the children are going to, you know, America to get a good life. They're going to study. And so, you know, the parents are always in a vulnerable situation. And so they say yes. But it's really important to emphasize that, because a lot of the times they really don't understand what adoption is. It's not explained to them. And they're also, as I said, in a very desperate situation. So adoptions have mainly, like, they kind of started with like ministries. And then after, you know, NGOs were starting to be involved, and adoption agencies working with the orphanages. So it's usually always the orphanages, ministries, NGOs, adoption agencies. And then, you know, when adoption started to speed up, because the demand for children became higher as adoptions closed, like in Guatemala, for instance, you know, there was a need to sort of increase the supply of available children. So that's when more of the trafficking started. I mean, there's always been trafficking and fraud, but they really, I guess, reached a peak in the 2000s. And so sort of the peak, and I mean, some of you are probably familiar with like the stories of fraud and trafficking. This has always happened, but it really skyrocketed. And so sort of the I guess mid to late 2000s, that's when things started to I guess like cool down, because it was just so absurd. So I have to keep track of time here because there's always a lot to say. So I think one thing to know is, so there was, okay, perfect. So there was, I mean, parents were lied to. They've also had their children stolen from them. They've been bribed. But the thing to understand is that it's always, I mentioned parents a lot, but it's actually not just parents. It's grandparents, it's the aunts, it's the uncles. As Khadijah mentioned, I mean, we're very communal culture, right? So children are often taken care of by different members of the family, but because of everything that was going on, whether that was like a war, conflict, illness, the death, family members or parents were finding themselves in a really difficult situation. And so they felt like the only way to give their child up, the only way to sort of survive, I guess, was really to give their child up. So the issue is really lack of support. And again, the idea that their kid is going to get a good life. So I mean, it's really devastating. And the thing is too, is that, again, I want to emphasize this. I'm talking a lot about, you know, the parents, but adoption is really about supply and demand. And there was a really big desire for healthy children. And so Ethiopia could supply that, and it did. So we really always have to keep in mind the fact that people want children. Ethiopia has that available. So there's this situation of children being like parents leaving their children and then adoptees arriving in the receiving countries. And for them, and you know, a lot of us, like we're kind of like caught in this situation, but you know, we're all just trying to like survive like everything, you know, the loss, because adoptees, I mean, some were babies, but a lot of them were up to the age of like, I would say like 8, 9. So they actually have memories of being back home. So it's been they remember the orphanage, they remember their parents, they remember their grandparents, they remember like the countryside, the landscape. So it's incredibly difficult for adoptees. You know, like, I mean, like Ethiopian adoptees are really resilient, and they've had to undergo a lot of hardships. And I don't think this is very, it's not really spoken about all the time, because, you know, as adopted people, we're often told that we're grateful and we have such a good life. And so we're always kind of thinking about like other people, and also, oh, I'm so lucky to be here. So that's a whole other conversation about like toxic gratitude, and how it sort of prevents people from grieving, and that it's okay to you know, to grieve what you lost, and also be angry, righteous anger at a situation that is deeply unfair. So again, there's much to say. I guess I'll leave it at that for now, but of course there's going to be a lot of questions, and I just want to close by saying that the situation right now, the genocide and the war that it's affecting everybody, for me, I mean, it's really been devastating, and you know, I hope this opens up more conversations about how we can help families find each other, reunite, and also support each other like we've always done. So I will leave it there at the moment. So thank you. I'll pass it on to the next person.
Well, Cassaye, I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing your perspective as an international and transracial adoptee, because as you're very familiar with, in this triad of adoptive parent, birth or original family, and the adopted child who becomes an adult, like it's often the adoptee who is then excluded from any kind of public discourse or kind of systematic research or producing knowledge around that experience. So I'm really grateful that you made the time to be here today. And I'll just add, you know, I've been thinking a lot about Ethiopia as an empire with my friend and my colleague, Ayantu Tebeso, and separately over here, thinking about New York City foster care. And it wasn't until, you know, seeing a lot of your tweets that I began to connect the nations and nationalities question in Ethiopia with the question around adoption. And I wanted to share an excerpt, because as we were fact checking from this event, I was reading a paper called Regulating Corruption and Intercountry Adoption. And I'll just read this one section, which says, one indicator of fraud was that nearly half of the adoptions were being sourced by a single Ethiopian province, Southern Nations, Nationalities, and Peoples Region, or the SNNPR. The abundance of children adopted out of this region suggested that some, if not many, were being produced through coercion and collusion with orphanages and even law enforcement. A researcher for the US Embassy in Ethiopia learned of allegations that orphanages in the SNNPR were bribing parents to give up their children without saying where the children would be going. And so I know you had mentioned this, but we really see Ethiopian international adoptions to start skyrocketing after it gets closed and tightened up in Guatemala. And when we look at the character of adoption, international adoption in Guatemala, it was disproportionately Mayan and indigenous peoples who are having their kids sometimes snatched from them at bus stops, and being really coerced, not just experiencing poverty, but being actively lied to, thinking that they were sending their kid to like America to go get like nice education and come back. And then in reality, what happens is that they're being preyed upon through this asymmetry of power, through these Christian institutions, with their child ripped away from them, often never to see them again. But also once that child comes to America, you know, the event that led to the closing of international adoptions in Ethiopia was not just the ongoingness of corruption and fraud that was happening, but the murder of a child, Hannah, by her adoptive parents in the US, which unfortunately is like, we see this at an incredibly high frequency compared to the rate of like child homicides by biological parents just in the general population. So thank you so much for sharing that, Cassaye. And then I just wanted to introduce Mabel Gebra-Madin, who is one of the founders of the Tigray Action Committee. She is a 35-year-old mother of 3 boys, the president of TAC, a nonprofit organization committed to ending the Tigray genocide, as well as assisting in rebuilding Tigray. Mabel's life work is dedicated to ensuring Black children are safe everywhere, be it in Tigray or Brooklyn. And I just wanted to say, I'm really excited to have Mabel's perspective. I mean, one, is really dope to have like an all Black women panel for this, but I'm really excited to share for Mabel to share her perspective. Because when we think about family separation, sometimes it's like in this prototypical way of adoption or foster care, but there's also the separation and displacement that happens from war into the refugee camp. And so that's kind of where Mabel is going to enter into the conversation. So go ahead.
Thank you for having me, Khadijah. That was a great intro. So I'm going to live in that. But I wrote a little bit, and so I'm just going to read it for my little presentation, and then we'll get into the questions and everything later that I'm really excited about. So I've been thinking about how my story relates to my parents as well as my children's. It's made me realize that family separation is a part of Ethiopian culture, and therefore all marginalized ethnicities within the country of Ethiopia, current country of Ethiopia. My mother was separated from her mom, and thus we were separated from her. My mother was separated from her own mother due to the Ethiopian government. My parents grew up during the Derg regime in the 1970s. My mother was taken from her home in rural Tembian and placed in a school in Mcdonald. She left her home at 14 and saw her mother only once before fleeing Tigray rather. After it took my mother, I'm messing this up completely. Let me fix that. It took my mother 12 years before she saw her mother again, 12 full years. And that's after she's moved to America. This is what's happening now. My mother saw people being killed in front of her. She saw a lot of things before she left her mother's home. While she was there, before leaving Tembian and fleeing Tigray, she saw people lined up, shot in front of her. She saw people dying of all different things. The Derg regime was incredibly horrible. They did horrendous acts, very, very similar to what Abiy Ahmed is doing now to Tigrayans. She ended up growing up in Mekelle, in the capital of Tigray, because she was forced to. The Derg regime, the government, was taking children, it was taking people who worked for the government, not necessarily for them specifically, but just worked in offices, people that would be useful, and taking them from their rural hometowns into the capital of Tigray so that they can watch over them, so that they can essentially brainwash them. They all lived in like different camps. And if they had family members that lived in the area, then they would live there rather than the camps that they had set up. My mother ended up being smuggled out of Tigray by Tigadalites. They were revolutionaries. They came and saved a lot of people. And so if you decided not to fight, and maybe you were either too young or scared, or that was just not something you were interested in, you would be helped out of Tigray and become a refugee in Sudan. Being born in the refugee camps where I was born, it separates you completely. When you're born as a refugee, you're only born knowing the culture that your parents can provide you. And so we moved from Sudan to Denver, Colorado. Everything that we learned about Tigray was through my parents' lens, as well as a small Tigrayan community that was in the process of growing back then. I have the regular FOB story, fresh off the boat, like most immigrants that come to the United States or any Western country. I came in speaking multiple different languages. I used to be able to speak Tigrinya fully. I used to be able to speak Amharic. I used to speak Arabic. Now I speak no language fluently, not one, including English. I screwed up all the time. I did that earlier. And so I was in ESL, which is English as a second language. And what ESL does to you, I'm not sure if this is common throughout the West, but I know in the United States, what ESL does to you is it takes your accent away. It forces you to become American. And so when I speak, no one knows where I'm from. They can't tell if I'm from New York, because sometimes I'm from New York, and sometimes I'm from Denver, and then sometimes I'm from Texas. Who knows? My accent can shift, and that's due to ESL. But I never sound African. I never sound anything other than American, except when I do my best to speak Tigray now. And I said, do my best, because that's what I'm trying to do. And so let me go back. And so as a refugee, the only way that you can really connect, or even just an immigrant, the only way that you can connect to your family in Tigray was either through visiting or on the phone. You can't visit very often because it's very expensive. It's expensive to fly. It's expensive to have hotels. It's expensive to provide funds for your family back home because they are dependent on those funds. And so it wasn't something that I was able to do a lot. I was actually only able to go back home once and be with my family. You lose connection to your family. You lose your culture. You lose your language. You lose so much history that you would only gain if you had more access and resources to your family back home. And so my grandmother, I know her, I know my grandmother, but have I had access to my grandmother in the way that I would have had I not been born in a refugee camp? Had I not had the experience of an immigrant in the United States, where like I was not able to I was not able to fly out whenever I wanted to. My parents did the best that they could. They did the best to assimilate within the United States, but that required food stamps, that required government assistance, that required poverty. And so how was I, as an immigrant child, going to be able to go to see my grandmother whenever I wanted when we were getting government cheese? Like, how is that a possibility? And so the connection is very, very hard to solidify. So my father, on the other hand, is from Hausen. He was separated from his family as a teenager as well. Growing up, my father's goal was to do anything he could for his family. He was planning on moving back to Tigray. He was planning on essentially retiring and starting businesses. He would talk about owning trucks and delivery systems, very much like what we do now in the United States. When you're on Instagram and you see people are like, oh, I started a trucking business. That was my dad back in the 90s doing his best in Tigray. And so that was his goal. He was finally able to achieve his goal and move back to Tigray. And that was pre-genocide. Now the genocide has hit. He has become an internally displaced refugee in Tigray. And the process has started all over again. It's just rinse, wash, repeat consistently. Now my children are experiencing what I experienced with my grandparents. They're experiencing with theirs. They can't call their grandfather. They can't go visit their grandfather. Tigray is under siege. There's no access at all. And so I can't speak to my father. That's one level of separation that my parents experienced. Now I'm experiencing. My children can't speak to their grandfather, which is a level of separation that I experienced. Now they're experiencing. Family separation in Tigray specifically has become a generational curse that we have not been able to escape. And it's affecting us in a really horrible way, because now my children are learning about Tigray and Tigrayan culture and Tigrinya through me. Mind you, I barely speak English fluently. So how are they going to learn Tigrinya? Do you know what I mean? So it's just like a consistent loss of culture. And this is what Ethiopia has done over and over and over and over again to Tigrayans. I don't know if that was a full 10 minutes. I probably spoke really quickly, but I did my best.
Thank you. And I just want to acknowledge, I know this is like super emotional. Mabel and Cassaye made fun of me because I'm the stoic one. They were like, when's the last time you cried? I was like, I think a decade ago. But I appreciate that you guys are more in touch with your emotions. And I just wanted to add, like, there's a huge connection between what's happening domestically in Ethiopia with imperialism. But the moment you even bring up imperialism, it's been so captured by this like fascistic right-wing movement within Ethiopia that if you hear a critique of imperialism or colonialism, it's almost triggering because you associate it with genocide denial. I say that to say that I've been really struggling with how do you critique and how do you displace the dominance of these NGOs, because it's through them, it's often the only way that we have a mechanism to bear witness, to see what is going on in Ethiopia, to kind of experience what is happening to our family members as part of the diaspora in the absence of being able to make that phone call. And in thinking through that, Women of Tigray really stood out to me through their Twitter account, because I felt like they were just giving such compassionate advice and framing around sexual assault being used as a weapon of war in the current genocide, and thinking about how do you support people, what are community practices, And so I'm really excited that they're able to join us today. And so Women of Tigray was founded at the height of the genocidal war by Tigrayan women and allies in the diaspora. It was intended to be an outlet and a voice for the women in Tigray who are facing horrific weaponized sexual violence and who were themselves silenced by an enforced telecommunications ban on the region. Women of Tigray was also intended to offer support and community to Tigrayan women in the diaspora, collectively and individually traumatized by personal loss. News of the terrible toll that was inflicted on civilians as a war strategy to break the community and an inability to communicate with loved ones. And with that, I want to welcome Salam from Women of Tigray.
Thank you, Khadijah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, you can? Okay, just making sure. Thank you for the introduction. I am representing Women of Tigray today. Just to give you a little brief, like you said, Women of Tigray was established almost a year ago, in March, I believe. And it started as a Twitter movement because Women of Tigray didn't have a voice at that time. They did prior to that, and it was formed by a few strong and resilient Tagaro women in the diaspora community in Europe and in the US. They're all scattered all over the world. And it's purely dedicated to amplify the voices of women and girls of Tigray, advocate for the end of rape in war, and to expand their responses to violence against women and children. So it started because, like you said, there was no services for women when the war broke out. We wanted to amplify their voices as they were shut down from communication completely. So I will address a few issues that I want people to recognize when it comes to not only our movement, but just Women of Tigray. So one of the most horrific aspects of the current genocidal war has been the way sexual assault has been used as a weapon of war. The ways the Tigrayan community, how has the Tigrayan community dealt with and supporting our women and children during this traumatic experience? As it stands, it's been 8 months since our the people who work in social services, health, and other areas have not been paid for more than 8 months. They have been, in general, are doing an amazing work in helping our women who have, like the community, has supported displaced communities such as in Tigray, sorry, I'm just repeating myself. So our displaced communities from all over Tigray are currently in Shire, Mcdonald, or all the big cities across Tigray. No resources available, but these social workers, doctors have been helping our communities, especially the women.
Salam, are you still there? Is it just me, or can you guys not hear them?
No, can't hear her.
It looks like it's muted, so I just asked to unmute.
Oh, Salam, if you can hear us.
I was just blabbing on about, were you not listening to me? Hello?
We couldn't hear you. You were muted all of a sudden.
Oh, I'm sorry. I must have.
Just about a few minutes.
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you now. You were just muted about 3 minutes into speaking.
Can I just say my favorite thing is that Khadijah always makes fun of the uncles for their tech inability, but
I can hear you now. Sorry.
you're good.
I went the volume down on my laptop, so didn't hear. So where did I stop? I'll just start from like midway through. So as I was saying, the people who work in social services, health, and other areas have not been paid for more than 8 months. They can't use their savings because banks are shut down. They can they can't ask for help because of lack of communication from their families. There is no other way to provide support to doctors or the victims of weaponized war, weaponized rape. Before June, many people were buying a lot of, so just to give you a context, the Tigrayan community in general,
I'm sorry, I know I make fun of the uncles so heavy, right? But you know what? They're not directly taking care of their children. I think that's part of what makes them uncles. And so my intergenerational household decided to go to war while we were having these technical difficulties. Not sure what happened to women of Tigray. Oh, Salam, you're back. Are you back? Are you like?
I am so sorry. I literally have switched from my phone. Okay.
All right, cool. Sorry. Go ahead. Third time is a charm.
The third time is a charm indeed. So where was I again? So can I start again?
I think start about your midway point.
Okay. So as I was saying before, before June, many people were buying a lot of emergency contraceptive from Addis and were sending it to Tigray so that at least women and girls do not get pregnant. And although more than 83% at that point of health services and hospitals have been destroyed by the health workers were performing abortions on women who were pregnant too. Both Eritrean and Ethiopian troops were threatening health workers, but still they were providing them with all the services without getting paid for more than 8 months. Regarding the community, there are like mixed responses. I don't know if you guys follow Gabra Maskal on Twitter, who documents all the sexual violence against women during this war. There's already been a trend of, in the Tigrayan community, there was already a trend of raising kids with the Tigrayan culture, and women and girls would still be integrated when weaponized war during the Derg regime was happening. But during this genocidal war, the way the atrocities happened was so horrific that some of the weaponized war was done in front of their families, their husbands. So our culture generally, the families that have been stigmatized, their own children and husbands that have been abandoned their wives during this horrific experience. Many of the women and girls were also raped in front of the male in the families, while making them kneel down and watch them as their loved ones are raped. So it's not only a physical trauma, mentally as well for the whole community and family. So the men who have seen these trauma have, they decided to leave their families as well. So women have been left to tend to their children in hospitals because they don't have neither food or anything to support their newborn that were born out of this traumatic experience. In general, the community has supported them a great deal, and they continue to do so. So as a woman of Tigray, we are trying to not only advocate, but once we have full access, we want to help our communities heal from these horrific experiences. And in terms of another question raised was, what do we want people to know about women of Tigray and excessive violence example? What are some values, cultural practices, historical experiences that we want to highlight as Tigrayan women? Tigrayan women have always been in the forefront and center in the struggle of our community, especially during the 17 years of struggle during the Derg era. Women of Tigray are like anchors of our community. I think Mabel, you mentioned as well earlier on. and they're supporters in every struggle in terms of self-determination. And during this genocidal war, we have seen women of Tigray left, they've left their children to join the fight with Eritrean and Ethiopian Amhara troops on the war front. While the diaspora women, as you can see, like you amazing ladies, we have been, leading the protest that's been happening all over the world. There are also the strategizing and, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. You have about, I think it maybe take about 1 or 2 more minutes.
Okay, I'll just skip through the next one. Okay, so in terms of nationalities and cultures within Tigray, we have the Arab community and the Tagaro and the Kunama. So Arab community Arab and Kunama community are a minority within a minority within minority, if you think about it, within Ethiopia. So it's about 40,000 in population. It's I hail, my father is from Europe actually. So in terms of our own cultural nationalistic, how we deal with atrocities, there was a border war in the 98 Eritrean border war, and that has been pretty much what we're seeing at the moment with the weaponized war and the disappearance of lots of people that has happened in the 98 war. So they have gone through that. Same with the Kunama community. But one of the things that stands out is for centuries, Europe exercised their own democratic and justice system. They elected their leaders according to it's a system called ONA. The practice, so they practice their justice system where conflicts is resolved within a community. Once it's resolved, they have a meal together as a community. So how it helps them during this ordeal is obviously there's a language barrier because they speak Saho, also Tigrinya, but they come as a community together, resilient and strong. Same with the Kunama minority as well, about 10,000 estimated, and they're in the brink of extinction because of this genocidal war. And one thing, give me 2 minutes, I would like to make this point. There has been comments surfacing online that sexual assault due to war or rape prior to the war in Tigray region was there. So it doesn't make any difference, which is completely absurd. It's very important to carefully to make assessment that conflict-related sexual violence is and how it's very different from gender-based violence in a community. So conflict-related sexual violence is used as a strategic, systematic, and calculated tool of war, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. So this has been shown in the war of Tigray as we are witnessing it now, where soldiers have specifically told survivors that they want to make them infertile and to cleanse their blood, to Amharanize them, and other genocidal war. So conflict-related sexual violence is used with a purpose to intimidate communities. In this war, Tigrayan community, destroying the social fabric and cohesion of specific group, and even as a final act of humiliation to dehumanize before killing them. So there has been number of this has been seen in a number of countries. So there should be a careful assessment of sadistic ways it was done and address the causes accordingly. Expert in this field has reiterated that the trends pre-war are not important when talking about CRSV. However, since obviously this is the question here, Tigray has progressed so much in addressing issues in traditional harmful practices such as early marriage and FGM, making it the lowest in Ethiopia. So according to the Ethiopian Demographic Health Study in 2016, the percentage of women who have experienced physical or sexual violence in the past 12 months from their husbands or their partners was the lowest in Tigray during the normal circumstances. And according to the data, Tigray region was one of the highest help-seeking behavior, like in terms of reporting. So highest being Addis with, I think it was 41.1, followed by the Southern Nation, and closely followed by Tigray. So 24.1% were reporting these violence. So this shows trust and awareness of the community in their service. So the regional government also has played a receptive and great role in this, taken prior to this war. So there was a GSTS initiative that was done. Other local movements were bearing fruit. I think online we have seen the Yukunno was led by Maaza, the movement that was being used.
Salim, just so you know, just if you could get to, sorry to interrupt you, but I want to make sure we have enough remaining time for the discussion. If you could finish this point.
Sorry, I'm literally wrapping up this point. So with the Yukunno movement, which was led by Maaza, that was being used against what's happening during this war. So they've made sure that to hold government accountable, the movement was done to hold government accountable in Tigray, and held events, including protests, meetings with the bureau heads and with other communities members to raise awareness about the issue. In other circumstances where GBV prior to the war should never be conflated with CRSV is a war crime committed by warring parties. That's what it is. So to break, essentially what it's doing is to break the soul of community. It is a global security problem, and it's not addressed on time. Obviously, it will make reconciliation and peace process very impossible, which is what we are seeing at the moment. So yeah, that's me done for the day.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you for sharing that and speaking on behalf of women of Tigray. So now we're going to open up for questions, and there's actually, I have a few questions that I wrote down, but one of the questions that somebody has already put into the Q&A actually dovetails with that nicely. And so I'll just editorialize for the beginning is that I wanted to bring up, adoption is this wild thing. I mean, even for Cassaye, I've been grateful that you have shared your story with me, but imagine, being born in Ethiopia and then waking up one day with white people who are Christians in the countryside of Quebec. It is kind of a wild, you're taken not only from your family, but from your culture into one of the coldest places on earth. Shout out to Minneapolis. I don't know how people are coping. And then, I think people, this is the thing with adoption, then people want to reconnect with, they want to belong, right? They want to belong to their homeland, often what is an imagined sense of community. Some of how we've seen that playing out is watching, adult adoptees being radicalized by Amhara nationalists and a far right-wing movement that's happening both within Ethiopia and its diaspora with the hashtag no more. So the question that Elizabeth Niaros, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your last name correctly, wrote is Khadijah started talking about quote unquote not being in relation to whiteness. And I think a lot of folks in the diaspora, including maybe especially transnational adoptees who are seeking a sense of belonging, gravitate toward nationalist tendencies that may introduce them to ideologies that support authoritarian regimes that they romanticize as beacons of anti-imperialism. How do we fight against this in a way that is compassionate, but also drawing a line at genocide denialism? So heavy question, but Cassaye, maybe you could give us some insight just from your perspective about what are your takeaways about this phenomenon, and what can we do to support, knowing that there's now, because of the current war and the current genocide, a new generation of adoptees being produced, or kids that are separated from their families?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's really important to understand that I think with adoptees, I say they, sometimes they say we, but I think for us, some of us were adopted into really heterogeneous, white communities. Others were adopted into areas that are more diverse, where there's Black people, where there's, other, brown people. But I think that for adoptees, Ethiopian adoptees, the most important thing is first of all, we feel like we're straddling different worlds. We're from Ethiopia, but we're also like, you know, culturally we're American, we're French, we're Canadian, you know, we're Swedish. So there's that. And but the story that we are told about Ethiopia and the Ethiopia that we know is really like the sort of more common imperial story of Ethiopia. That's really what we have exposure to. So and also I think for adoptees, like we're not really, and I know maybe saying Ethiopian is very triggering for people because, you know, this you know, discussion is about like, you know, the questions of like, you know, nations, nationalities, and reconnecting with our like indigenous roots. But the thing is, for adoptees, like we're not really part of that conversation. Like, and so that's why I say Ethiopian, because that's how most of us identify. For me personally, I don't really know where I'm from, so I can't really claim to be anything else because maybe it's not true. And I mean, I joke about not being, you know, I don't want to be the Rachel Dolezal, you know, Tigray, or, you know, so, but so, yeah, but going back to the point is that for us, like, we just want a connection to Ethiopia, and also like the Ethiopian communities that adoptees are part of, like that they're like, they don't want to lose that connection to the community. So like, you have to understand that for most adoptees, like they're hearing, like they're hearing reports about Tigray, and then they go to church with Ethiopians, or they go to the restaurants and they're hearing a different story. So, and then, you know, they know that there's, you know, fake news is a thing. So it's very, very confusing for us. And so I think a lot of people are like, they don't really know what to understand, like not what to understand. They don't really know what to believe, and they don't have people like telling them like what is actually going on. Personally, I had to DM people on Twitter and you know, Instagram to actually like connect with people that had views that were different from the friends that I had. Because I just thought everybody loved each other. We're all Ethiopian. We're all like, you know, hugging, dancing around in the circle. Like that's what I thought we were about. So, and I'm sure like other adoptees kind of feel the same. So, I mean, it's been challenging for a lot of them, but for me, like I actually had to search for the information. It wasn't until I got on Twitter that I was starting to learn like, oh, like Oromo people, like, you know, like this is what happened to them. This is what happened to people in Tigray. This is what happened to people, you know, in the southern regions. Like you have to really know somebody, because unfortunately, like people will not just tell you. You know, so I think that's also very sad. I honestly, I was really, I felt like hurt actually that I didn't know like about all these tensions, and because I just felt really ignorant and I felt embarrassed about it. And then I realized like, it's not actually my fault. Like I have been disconnected from everybody. And so it's been a big learning curve for me. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. And so as going back to the point about like adoptees, you know, talking about no more and being part of the movement. Well, I think again, for them, like, you know, it's like they're only getting like this sort of view. And also, you know, they have their parents or relatives that they reconnected telling them, you know, like this is what's happening, and they don't want to lose that connection. Like adoptees have been separated from their culture, from their families. So the communities that they have, the Ethiopian community, that's all some people have. They don't want to lose that connection. And so I think, you know, it saddened me, but I also think that, you know, we have to be, I believe, because it really angered me and it saddened me deeply, but I'm trying to really realize like, look, people are in a hard situation. And so try to give them grace. And I say that because I've talked to people before, and I said, like, you know, this isn't an anti-war movement. It's not. And then people were like, are you saying I'm supporting war? I'm not supporting war. And so then I was like, okay. So I just try to not judge people. And I know that's hard because our family, like, you know, people are dying and everything, but adoptees are kind of in a really difficult position. So.
Thank you for sharing that, Cassaye. And on the question of not being told, I feel like these familial silences also happen, you know, in the diaspora. And Maba, I was hoping that you could say a little bit about kind of what were the stories that you were getting from your mother, from your grandparents, to help you process what was going on from being born in a refugee camp in Sudan to coming to the United States and, you know, living the FOB life as you described it.
Fob life, hashtag. But so the stories that I was getting when I was a kid were, well, the thing about me is I ask a lot of questions. I don't know how obvious that is, but I ask a lot of questions and I've always been that way. And so with my mom and my dad, I was constantly asking them questions about back home, about their childhood, about how they grew up. And so they shared a lot of their experiences with me because I asked. But I know a lot of folks who are in the same situation as me, same age, same generation, who know very little because they're not prone to ask and their parents weren't prone to share. So I don't know how well that answers that question, but yeah, I learned a lot just through constantly asking my parents, like, what is my grandmother like? And what is your mom like? And what did your dad do? And, you know, things like that. So by asking all those questions, I was able to learn a lot about my family and their history, a lot about Tigray and its history, but only to a certain extent. There was a point when I was talking to my mom. There's this really great podcast. I've been talking about it a lot if you follow me on Twitter. I'm a big fan of this podcast. It's called Tarek Time. But they talk about...
Say the title again so we could drop the link in the chat.
Tarek Time, it's TARIK Time, TIME. It's by the United Tagaru Canada or United Canada Tagaru. I'm not sure. Oh, you've listened to it? It's my favorite. I love it. I was on one episode. But anyway, not trying to boast, but anyway, it's the best. And they talk about like ancient Tigray history. They talk about like what Tigray was before it became Christian, like pagan beliefs, like a lot of different things. And so if you listen to the episode that I'm in, I mentioned how I called my mom and asked her, like, Mom, did you know about this? Were you taught this in school? What did you learn, you know, when you were still in school in Mcdonald versus being in Tembian? Like, what did your teachers teach you? And she said to me, well, first off, none of that is true because we're Christian. And it's like, well, yeah, you're not going to say anything about pagan history as a Christian, I understand. But then second off, we weren't taught any of those things because when we were being taught by the Derg regime, we were being taught about like socialism and communism and why the government was better and why we should continue to support them. And we really didn't learn very much about like Tigray or about what we would know our culture to be. The generation older than us and the generation younger than us learned so much more. And so if you have questions about that, you'd have to ask like your great grandparents, or you'd have to ask my younger siblings or kids your age who have access to different things, right? And so they don't know a lot of things either. And that's just due to separation and the government taking over and teaching them something that they want them to know. What Ethiopia has done and continues to do is to make it one base nationality, one base language, one base culture, right? And so right now they're doing it against the Tigray. They want us to speak Amharic. They want us to be Amhara. They've taken IDs and changed them to Amharic nationality versus Tigrayan. They have moved in Amharic people into Tigrayan homes and forced Tigrayans out through massacres and just forced displacement. And so that's what they were doing to my mother and her generation back then, is by brainwashing them and teaching them something that they maybe have use for now, being that we're in the same situation, but really, really lost a lot of their culture and history. So I was able to learn everything through them, but, you know, still a lack of information because they weren't taught it either.
Thank you. My kind of two-part question that's really open to anybody is that, you know, one of the things that I love about you, Mabel, is that you identify as unapologetically Black all the time, right? And you know, there's also so much anti-Blackness that characterizes a lot of our diaspora communities, and this is not specific to Tigray or to Oromia, but I mean, it's just like, it's out there. I mean, the Amhara nationalists are not the only ones that got problem with anti-Blackness, but also I was thinking about how that anti-Blackness is also anti-Indigenous. Like I was imagining when you were speaking, Cassaye, about your Ethiopian friends, how they felt when you learned the word Oromo, right? Like I'm sure that went over very well. But, you know, I think sometimes the way, especially like as being raised as a first gen person in the United States, a lot of times like my uncles, aunts, my father in particular, you know, coming here, like part of the way they want to preserve your culture is like being exceptional. Not like the other Blacks, not like the Black American people. Even if I had many cousins or uncles, and, you know, even myself when I was a young parent was on food stamps, public assistance, but you don't talk about that because that's not us. That's right. Maybe right now at this moment, we might need that check on the first, but that's not us because that's not a Tigrayan, that's not an Oromo, you know, we're not like those. And so how do you think anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity kind of plays out in these dynamics? And that's open to any of you.
Can I answer just my part and then whoever else wants to?
Okay, Bill, you chomping at the bit.
No, I'm gonna do that. Khadijah knows I'm gonna do that. But anyway, I feel like anti-Blackness is not just an Ethiopian thing, Tigrayan thing, Oromo thing. It's not just us, right? It's East African, it's African, and it's immigrant based, right? So there is like an ideal immigrant narrative that is in the United States. I'm sure it's for the West too. And ideal immigrants in the West, or rather United States, are Indian, are Asian, are generally Asian. They're never Black, they're never African, they're never us, right? So there's anti-Blackness just in general when it comes into the immigrant space. And then when you're an immigrant, you want to be the best of the best immigrant that you can possibly be because you're assimilating and you want white people to look at you and be like, oh, this is the best kind of immigrant there is. And so that happens a lot within our community. But I know for me, I try and be as Black as I possibly can be, because I know when I'm seen in these streets, because I be out there, when I'm seen in these streets, they see my skin before they see anything else. They don't see a woman first. They don't see a Tigrayan. They don't see anything. They see me as Black. If a cop pulls me over, I'm a Black person first, right? They don't see anything else. And so I will be Black first for the entire essence of me. I will be Black first, right? And then there was another thing that you said that I want to remember, but now I can't because I'm all in my Blackness. So if anybody else wants to say something,
indigeneity and around the Oromos, and yeah,
I'll come back.
So Salam or Cassaye, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah. So I think with adoptees, you know, as I mentioned, you know, I was adopted into a white family, and like most of us are. I've heard maybe like 1 or 2 adoptees that are adopted by like Black people, but there are some. But so I think for us, you know, we all have different situations, right? Like some, as I mentioned, some grew up like areas where there's more like Black people. When I say Black people, that really depends. Like it could be Black American, you know, Caribbean, African immigrants, you know, Black Canadians, like Scotians. But I think for us, you know, we're like, okay, there's really a lot to say. This is a whole topic in itself. But I would say like a lot of us are trying to find our way back to what we lost, right? So I think being like around people who look like us is very, very important. And I mean, I have adoptee friends who like Ethiopian adoptee friends who for them, it's about like, it's about being Black first, you know, and it's important because as Mabel said, it's not like, you know, if you get stopped by the cops, they're not going to be like, oh, you're Ethiopian, here, you can go. It's like, no, you're Black, you know, it's like it's just, it's crazy. So I think for me, you know, I was actually like very shocked at how anti-Black our communities can be. And I really experienced it when I was in Ethiopia, when I went to Gondar, which is actually the region where I don't know if I'm from there, but I was found in Amhara in Gondar. And so I went there and, you know, I was talking to people and I got into a conversation with a guy he was young and he was telling me like, we're not Black, we're not African. And it was mind blowing. It was like, I am sitting, like I'm in Gondar right now. I'm in Africa and you're telling me that we're not Black and we're not African. So that was like the weirdest experiences, but I would say like I have like encountered that within our community. And I really hope that that's something that, you know, we can work on, that we can have conversations with, you know, with each other and confront that, like that really anti-Black racism that we have towards other Africans and Black people, because, you know, they, you know, we are them and they're us. That's how I feel. So that's a short answer, but this is like a big discussion when we talk about like adoptee and race. Like we could talk about this for 5 hours, right?
Salam, I wanted to give you a chance. Did you want to respond to that question?
I just wanted to like, actually just from my experience, I just wanted to share that obviously I come from obviously Tigrayan family. My dad is from Europe and my mother is I grew up in Addis for quite until I was like 12 or so, and then I moved to the UK. So I grew up in a household where I was Tigrayan first, even though I was in Addis. My parents were quite like, we are Tagaru type of situation. I speak Tigrinya fluently. When I moved to the UK, of course, every time there's a question, especially when you're from quite a few places, like, where are you from? That, like, where are you from situation used to really confuse me. It's like, right, okay, technically I'm from Addis. I never lived in Tigray. But then again, there's a question, obviously you're African, but I always say like, right, I'm from Ethiopia, I can say that. And then I always made sure that I was like, oh, I'm Tigrayan first, really. Like that was my background. But it was never an issue of like, we are Black. You can see my, you know, my skin tone or where I've always put, I was raised in a household where I am Tigrayan. I'm proud of my identity. All my families have happened to be from that region. So that for me, that was the, you know, the transition. People actually find it quite strange at the moment, transcending from like, you know, oh, Ethiopia and Tigray. I'd never had that issue. So I'm like Tigrayan, obviously Tigray is an Ethiopia type of situation. And I'm in Africa. So yeah, Tigrayan first type of situation. So it makes this transition for me quite easy.
Well, I was just going to add, and I mean, I apologize to people who have heard me tell this story like 7 times, but like anti-Blackness in the Ethiopian context is like whiplash, because, you know, they're like, oh, we like never colonized, we're like the pinnacle of Black freedom. Then they hit you with some like, ew, why so dark, right? Or call you a dog or something. And so my grandmother was so racist, you know, bless her heart, she's dead now, but the last time when I saw her was in 2009. And I had traveled to Finfinne, to the capital, which is Addis, but it's stolen Tulama ground, so we call it Finfinne, and to see her. And, you know, she has these 2 cataracts, she can barely see. I'm sitting next to my cousin, my first cousin, he's like dark skin. Obviously, I'm like the lightest person in my family. And we're eating shiro, right? And she's sitting on this like slightly elevated platform, and she's eating dorowat. And she's like, come eat. And she's like, why are you eating with the Blacks down there, this peasant food, you know? And like basically calling him Galla. And imagine like I'm her grandchild, but so is he. Like we're equally descended from her, right? And she's like, don't sit down there with the darkies, like eating vegetables. Come up here with the lights, eating dorowat. And I was like horrified because like doro is like trash. Honestly, like shiro, like rising is the best. And 2, I was like, yo, what happened to you? What happened to you? And I think the question of like, what happened to you in Ethiopia? We don't talk enough about the afterlives of slavery, about indentured servitude, about what is the source of this anti-Blackness, because I do think it gets mediated to this question of immigration and like who is a good immigrant subject in the US or the EU context, right? But like how it's produced in the continent, it's not like something in the soil. You know, it is this like colonialism and enslavement. And like slavery was legally abolished under Selassie in what, 1945? And we already know what time it is. We know that legally should be having it legally now. So we definitely know that slavery continued after that. We don't have that kind of exact accounting. But I know in my own family, we have stories about cousins being sent, you know, to so-and-so's house so that they could get a better education and essentially being forced into indentured servitude, right? And like, that might have been your nephew, but now he's, you know, working 23-hour shifts and he gets 2 days off every 3 months, right? And like, some of this is indexed by complexion, some of this is indexed by like nationality, some of it is indexed by like who got displaced when, due to which famine, war, or NGO, you know, like all of these different situations, right? But this is like part of what characterizes so many rifts in our family. And I would say like, it's definitely, as my father and I on two different ends of the political spectrum. And now I'm like, in retrospect, I couldn't believe, like, he sent me a picture from the archives when I was 6 with this shirt with Haile Selassie. I mean, I was killing it. I look great. But I could not believe that I was wearing this shirt celebrating a monarchy that advocated for the enslavement of Black people. I could not believe this, right? Like, what is the fascism behind this? I could not understand it. And as I have been Oromo my whole life, but as I'm becoming more conscious and more politicized around it, because I grew up in New York, right? Like, I wasn't thinking about that. I was out here just being, you know, my identity was Black and listening to hip hop. I didn't think about this in the same way. As I'm realizing it now, it's making more legible. Like when I worked in the Ethiopian restaurant, I just thought they loved Teddy Afro. I didn't understand why they kept telling me to cut that Hachalu stuff off. It didn't click. The math wasn't mathing. Now I understand, right? So I want to be conscious of time since we only have about 10 more minutes. But one of my questions I want to make sure that we get to is that, you know, in terms of thinking about displacing NGOs, and each of you touched on this a little bit, but I want to, maybe we could go around and everyone could highlight a kind of community healing practice that they saw practice in their, you know, in your own community, so to speak. Or, you know, for you, Cassaye, I know that you are like very conscious of not being able to pinpoint like am I Amhara, am I Teguru, or whatever it is, but you can talk about what you have observed, you know, around organizing, the adoption, you know, justice movement, and maybe you, Mabel. Did you hear my question?
No, girl, you went on mute. I didn't hear nothing.
Oh, you guys heard nothing that I said?
Like, I heard most of it and then you cut off.
You were cutting off a little bit.
Oh, sorry. I think my kid has a Roblox addiction, which sometimes impacts my internet connection. But I was saying maybe each of you could highlight a community healing practice that you see in each of your settings.
Sure. Oh, I'm going first. All right, cool. So what I've noticed is that within the diaspora, we have taken a lot of our cultures from back home. We tend to do the same things that they did back home because, you know, we're first generation. And so when someone passed, we'd have our hazans, we would have the 40-day essentially celebration, just remembrance of the person who passed. We have Iko, we were speaking about this earlier in the week, where it's almost like a mutual aid fund, something of like a savings system where mostly women, generally speaking, will get together every month and they will all put money in a pot, and then each woman will have a chance to get that pot on a monthly basis. I think that might be something that we just technically learned is maybe throughout Ethiopia and not just Tigray. But a lot of the things that we did in the diaspora were brought from back home. And so, yeah, you know, I want to touch on really quick what Sam said earlier. Tagaru Tigrayans, we were always taught that we're Tigrayans first before anything else. That's just how we are. We weren't really taught to be Ethiopian, especially in the diaspora. I don't know about the ones that really grew up in Ethiopia and Addis, but the ones in the diaspora, we were taught that we were Tigrayan first most of the time. And when we were told that we were Ethiopian, it was due to like just popularity of what Ethiopia was and what Ethiopia had become. And so with that, a lot of the cultures and methods that we used as a community in Tigray were brought with us. And so we have our coffee ceremonies together the same way, we eat the same way, we have, and especially specifically like dependent on the area in Tigray that you're from. And so Salam's dad is from Europe, he's a Game. My dad's from Hausa, I'm a Game. So we'll eat like similar foods, and only our people will eat that within that like little area, like Zahlo is really specific to us or something like that. And so a lot of our cultures and things came with us. Sorry.
I
It sounded like
think
you were gonna say something.
she just unmuted by accident.
Oh, okay. Anyway, but essentially that's all I was going to say, is that we tend to do what we would have done if we were in Tigray anyway. We will do like fun things like vaginal steaming and esme. Esme is like butter that we make and we put it all over our hair and our bodies. And the women will get together and like fix their netzalas and their habashakaran and like those types of things. So a lot of the stuff that we did back home, we do here too.
Salam, did you want to speak next?
Yeah, I was just going to touch up on what Mabel said. Yes, Tagara women. I like I said, I grew up in a household where I am Tigrayan first, even though I grew up in Addis and not even in Tigray. I visited Tigray maybe as teens when I was in the UK, even though I spoke quite fluent Tigrinya. Growing up in Addis, I was told to like speak Tigray and know your language because both my parents speak Tigrinya, although they speak Amharic too. So I was raised in even though I was not in the community, I was raised in a very proud, where are you from? I'm from Tigray, but obviously Tigray is in Ethiopia type of situation. Again, with the cultural issues, my father is from Europe, so that means he's a minority within a minority within Tigray. So they have their different languages. So Europe people speak Saho. So that means they have language barriers to use certain services when they go within Tigray, forget the rest of Ethiopia. And they have their own ways of doing certain things, even though it's part of like an Agama region. So we have the same culture, people in Adigrat, housing and everything. So being from that community and still having to live in the diaspora community is, you know, I'm still proud and I still represent, and I'm, you know, always, I don't know if you, you know, I'm
Sorry,
still representing.
sometimes you're like breaking up, like you walking away from the phone.
Okay, sorry. So as I was saying, still representing where we're from, not only like as a region, but it would be like technically your village, even though we, you know, we were not raised in that environment. It's always important to underline and advocate for the people that are left behind, that not only that they don't have voices, they do have voices. At the moment, their voices are not being heard because obviously communication blockade and everything. It's important to raise awareness, not just as a minority, but as just as a whole region. We need that, and it's quite important to push that forward.
Go ahead, Cassaye.
Yeah, so I think healing's really, really important. I think for adoptees, something that's really healing is, of course, food, I would say. And also, I mean, I'm not religious at all, but I know a lot of people are. So like, you know, going to church is important. And also, you know, going back to Ethiopia, that's really a big deal. A lot of people are, you know, they want to find their families, they want to reunite with their families. So people have done searches to reunite with their families. And I mean, that's not always a healing process. It's actually can be really difficult. And but I think that reconnecting with what was lost, I think that there is healing in that. So yeah, I would say like anything cultural, and also writing. You know, a lot of actually adoptees are writers. We're very big into the arts. We're very big into like social work. But yeah, I would say like any forms of like, you know, expression. So I think in the book, I'm very excited for the anthology that will be coming out, and you know, that will talk about, you know, some of the things that adoptees have experienced, and but yeah, we could doing anything like cultural, connecting with the culture, I think is really important. Yeah. It's a sense of belonging.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think it's like the sense of belonging that's very important. I think even if like many feel like, you know, we always feel like we're straddling two different worlds, there is a sense of like, I think like home, like going back home is something that people talk about, and it's very important.
Apologies for interrupting you. I feel like this has technically been so fraught situation. Can you guys hear me okay? Yay, okay. So I just wanted to share one question and then a comment from the Q&A, and then we're gonna start wrapping it up because I want to be mindful of people's time, and it already is 6:30 on the Eastern Standard Time. I'm not a practicing Muslim, but I didn't know until like recently that all Oromos are not Muslim. I grew up in my community. I thought that was the whole world as a child. And I felt like I grew up in this really strong knit Oromo Muslim community. And even though I feel like the way Islam is practiced right now, like even when I was a kid and I would go to Islamic school, it was in like this main mosque in Manhattan that was founded by Kuwait. And it was very Saudiized. I always used to get yelled at because I have like a heavy New York accent. They'd be holding my throat and be like, oh, you know, and there was all of this like tension between the Arabs and the Black people there. But like in our family homes in the community center, like one of the biggest holidays, and now like I understand, like my grandfather was a sheikh and more influenced by like Sufism. One of the biggest holidays is Muhammad's birthday. And so even when I went back to Ethiopia, actually, it was on Muhammad's birthday in 2009 there. And there's two traditional like Wakafena, like Oromo spiritual leaders, indigenous spiritual leaders, two sheikhs, and like two massive vials of chat, like huge. And it was like chat, for those who are not like from the area, is like it's like an amphetamine that you chew. It's like the equivalent of indigenous people in the Americas chewing like coca leaves, basically. And so it was like people praying in Arabic and in Afan Oromo, and it's like everybody has their hands up and there's kids chanting and their grandmothers and everybody. It's like both this, it's a very sacred moment, right? And you have these like traditional and prayers in Arabic, and then everybody just gets high for like 28 hours. And I feel like that's part of the healing process too. Some of that might be like a little maladaptive, but other parts of it, I think, are trying, like you see in that moment, like all these layers of trying to figure out like the secular, the sacred, the external religious influences, the traditional religious influences. But so much of my experience has been these things often coexist with each other. Like to be Muslim wasn't to reject your Oromoness. To be Muslim wasn't necessarily to reject the traditional leadership. I mean, that might not, some of the things seems to have shifted in this 2022. So that might not be the case anymore, but that's a lot of what I grew up with. And I can't believe it. This has been 90 minutes, y'all. But this has been an incredible like inaugural kickoff event for our series exploring the family regulation system. So I really just want to echo another thank you to each of you for sharing what is like really difficult stories, but I also hope for those of you who are in the audience that you can keep these conversations going. I do joke around and drag the uncles a lot, but I mean, I also tried to emphasize that we are the age that we are actually frankly older than they were when they started stuff. Like we are the elders now, and the responsibility is onto us to take these fraught and flawed inheritances and transmit the information to the next generation. Like we really like it's not some external force coming here. And I think we can't just leave it to these like outside entities and these outside institutions. We have to build something different. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you to all three of you. Yeah, I appreciate it. And thank you so much to Michael. And I definitely want to shout out Benjamin Lundberg, Torres, Sánchez, who was on the call, because I'm terrible at graphic design. They hooked up this flyer. They did a very good job. They're also an international adoptee traffic person, and they're helping put together the last 3 events of this series, because it was really important for me not to just to provide people a platform, but to seed ground so adoptees could design their own series of events. So just shout out to them. And I think that's it, y'all. Oh, we're gonna put the recording up on YouTube. We sorry, we had a little technical difficulty, but that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.